I'd like to welcome you to the second seminar this semester. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jane Ray, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Geary University and who's also a member of NERSA. Today, Jane is going to be presenting work on rethinking the transformation of parents' values and aspirations for their children. Jane.
Thank you very much.
And I should also add that Jane found her way to Geary and didn't get lost. I think that's a plus.
Miracle. Beautiful miracle. So thank you very much. As you can see from the slide, this is work that I'm doing with my colleague Ruth Geary in NERSA at Maynooth University. And the background to this research is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fairly substantial body of work now in sociology on changing parental values and aspirations for their children. And there is a pretty consistent body of work showing that over the 20th century, there has been a long-term trend away from an emphasis on conformity, measured by questions, very frequently questions where parents are asked to rank or to select the attributes or the qualities that they would like to see in their children in survey research. And consistently, this research has shown that parents have become increasingly more likely to value things like independence and imagination, and less likely to value things like obedience and religious faith and so on. And the hypothesis or the argument has been that this long-term trend towards a prioritizing or a favoring of autonomy or self-direction, as it's sometimes also referred to, has to do either with changes in the class structure, and the original argument hypothesized by Melvin Cohn, where he suggested that people who work in occupations that require obedience and conformity are more likely to value those attributes in their children, and vice versa, people who work in occupations that require self-direction are more likely to value things like independence and creativity and imagination in their children. So the hypothesis would be that as the occupational structure has changed in Western societies, then simultaneously the kinds of values that parents have for their children have changed. Other research has tended to show that it's most consistently related to changes in levels of education. So as levels of education in the population increase, people become more likely to value autonomy and independence. However, within the quantitative research, there has been some perhaps more recent, some of it's not so recent, but more recent research suggesting that other factors are coming into play in explaining variation both within historical period and across time. For example, research by Zhao has shown that maybe a significant amount of the change in American society can be explained by changes in the values and aspirations that women in particular hold for their children, so that it's a much more gendered transformation than previous research seemed to suggest. There's fairly consistent research suggesting that there may be differences in the values held by people of different religious, particularly Christian denominations. So Alwyn, for example, found that a lot of the change seemed to be explained, again in the United States, by a rather rapid transformation amongst Catholics in terms of, after Vatican II, in terms of the kinds of values and they held for their children. And I suppose most recently of all, Swedish scholar Fjellvang has suggested that if you compare values and attributes across what he calls cultural religious zones in Europe, you find that Catholic countries, particularly in the south, are more likely to value what we might consider traditional attributes such as obedience and conformity than the northern sort of Protestant religious zones. And Ireland, as you might expect, sort of sits, as in so many of these dimensions, sort of somewhere in the middle, generally more like, according to Fjellvang's research, the sort of southern Catholic countries. So I'll be coming back to this. So the point is that even though these things have changed very significantly in Ireland as well as everywhere else, in many ways in the expected direction compared to other Northern European societies, Fjellvang argued Ireland, has a higher proportion of parents, for example, valuing obedience than would be true, say, in Sweden or Germany. There's also been recent qualitative research which has kind of maybe complexified or made cast some qualifications on this overall finding. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Annette Laro's work on concerted cultivation, and she has an interesting article with her colleague where she talks about, well, if middle-class parents really value independence and autonomy in their children, they have a very strange way of showing it in terms of their parenting practices, because of course her qualitative research tended to show that middle-class parents were much more directive of their children, much more inclined to organize every minute of their lives, schedule all their activities and so on. So middle-class parents may have desired or may adhere to the idea that children should be creative and independent and self-directed, but in practice the style of parenting that middle-class parents adopt seems to encourage precisely the opposite at one level, whereas it's working class parents who tend to adhere to this idea of natural growth, letting children grow up and do things in their own way and find their own path. Another recent set of publications by Sarah Irwin and her colleague coming out of the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, they did some qualitative research which was somewhat critical of Laroe, because what they found was that the class differences that she claimed to have observed, in interview data at any rate, were not nearly as pronounced as her research seems to suggest. So they found much more overlap and shared aspirations and values amongst middle class and working class parents than Laroe's ethnographic research in the United States might seem to suggest. And they also found, and again I think I'll be coming back to this, that the same terminology, the same words can actually mean different things to people in different class contexts. So what independence, for example, might mean if you ask a working class parent, do they value independence on a survey, what they mean when they tick yes might be actually quite different from what a middle class parent means. So they've kind of raised some questions about this in their qualitative research. Just to jump ahead, what I'm going to try to persuade you of our argument today is that based on our analysis of Irish data, we suggest that we can reframe or rethink these changing values and aspirations in terms of what we call these four distinctive ethoses, and I'll explain perhaps a bit more what I mean by this notion of ethos. So I argue that if you look over the history of what parents tell you about their values and aspirations for their children, they cluster under these four headings. There's an ethos of standing back and allowing children to find their own path, an ethos of happiness and self-fulfillment, that whatever children do in life, they should be happy, they should find fulfillment in what they do. There's an ethos of achievement, certainly, and also of the parental responsibility for cultivating achievement in their children, and a fourth one, which occurs across all of the different groups that I looked at in different ways, an ethos of relatedness and respect to others. And what I want to argue is that all of these ethoses are aspects of the development of modernity in Irish society. So rather than saying, we've seen a transition from standing back towards cultivation and independence, I want to argue that all of these different ethoses co-evolved, if you like, during the course of modernity in Ireland, and they have been mobilized perhaps at different historical periods by different groups. They're available to a greater or lesser extent to different groups, but nonetheless I'm going to try to persuade you that they're all should be understood as attributes or dimensions of the set of values that make up Irish modernity. So I want to argue that these are morally inflected configurations of norms that people articulate, and they reflect a couple of things, as the existing research has also already suggested. They reflect people's expectations about the future, because when you ask people what they value in their children, they're future-oriented in their response. They're thinking about their children's future lives, so they reflect that understanding of the future. But they also reflect their people's perceptions about what other people believe is good and what other people's practices are. So just, I hope you can see the black lettering, just to tell you where the data are coming from. I'm making the mistake of going to the wrong side of it. So these data we sort of are based on, we started looking at these data as part of an IRC-funded project, which was called the Family Rhythms Story project. And the idea behind that project was that it would be a kind of demonstrator for the secondary analysis of qualitative data. And it brings together two fairly substantial qualitative data sets held in the Irish Qualitative Data Archive. One of them is the qualitative module from the Growing Up in Ireland, the child cohort, which includes 120 semi-structured interviews with the parents of 9-year-olds and also the 9-year-olds themselves, but for the purpose of this paper I'm focusing particularly on the parent interviews. And as another database, which is called the Life Histories and Social Change dataset, which includes 113 guided life story interviews with people who were born in 3 different birth cohorts. People born before 1935, people born between 1945 and 54, and people born between 1965 and 74. All of these participants had previously taken part in the Living in Ireland study, which was the Irish module of the European Community Household Panel, which is kind of the predecessor to Silks, and all of that's a lot of information, but it's bringing together these two fairly substantial qualitative data sets to try to interrogate the long-term pattern of social change in parents' values and aspirations. Both of these are available in the Irish Qualitative Data Archive. I should point out, though Ruth would like me to point out, because she's been working very hard on this, for my presentation I include all 113 interviews that we got permission to use as part of the research project, because I was a principal investigator on life histories and social change, but due to restrictions on anonymization and confidentiality and various things, 100 of those interviews are available for other people to reuse through the IQDA. So there are obviously challenges and potentially problems and questions you might have to ask me about what's involved with bringing these two very, in some ways similar, but in other ways quite different data sets together. I like to think of them as opportunities as much as challenges. In the first place, the interviews have these quite different temporal and subject perspectives. So the Growing Up in Ireland interviews are focusing on the child. The cohort is based on the birth of the child, not the birth of the parents. And it's very much forward-looking. It's asking parents to think about their children in the future. On the other hand, the life history and social change interviews were very much framed as life history narratives. So they were asking people to tell us the story of their lives, beginning with their own childhoods. So when people come round to talk about their values and aspirations for their children, they've already been thinking a lot about their own histories and their own past. So to a certain extent, their perception or their perspective is more backward-looking in terms of its kind of subject and temporal framing than the Growing Up in Ireland interviews. I think this is an opportunity because it allows you to bring these two quite different perspectives together in thinking about these patterns of social change. There is also, interestingly, a certain amount of overlap between the third life history and social change cohort and the parents of the GUI children. So they will be, some of them at least, in the same age category. And that turned out to be an advantage that I hadn't anticipated, because whereas Growing Up in Ireland is semi-structured and all of the interviewers pretty consistently asked a question about, what are your hopes for whoever it is in the future, Life Histories and Social Change, that was one of the prompts that the interviewers were encouraged to ask, but it was a more unstructured format. So if the interview wasn't really going in that direction, sometimes the question wasn't asked. And what turned out is that in the third cohort of Life History and Social Change, people in lower socioeconomic groups turned out to be underrepresented in terms of how frequently they talked about their values and aspirations for their children. So it was fortunate then that I can bring that together with the Growing Up in Ireland data to get a fairly reasonable socioeconomic distribution. I want to talk a little bit about this whole issue of values and aspirations, because some of you might be thinking to yourselves, well, those are quite different things, and you're right in some respects. The literatures have evolved quite differently, so people who work on aspirations are very often different scholars from the people who work on values. Though it does seem, in another another sense, it seems a little strange that that should be the case, because for two reasons, I suppose. The theoretical explanations clearly link values and aspirations. So, for example, if Combe is talking about, you know, the relationship between parents' own workplace experiences and the values, unless he's suggesting that the sort of transmission of values is completely unthinking, and in fact he isn't if you read his work. I mean, he is sort of saying that people's values reflect their perceptions, their understandings, their views about where their children will end up. So to some extent there's a relationship with aspiration. But I suppose much more strongly, in the participant narratives, the two are completely interwoven. So if you ask people a question about what your values are for your children, very often they'll answer referring to aspirations, or vice versa, or much more frequently they weave the two things together. So this is just one example from Growing Up in Ireland, where the respondent is, what would your goals be for Sean? They have to do with, obviously, achievement, going to university, but they also have to be with the kind of attributes that the respondent would like Sean to have, the kind of person that he would be, and his values. And so there I could show you numbers of examples of that coming from across the socioeconomic spectrum, where people respond to a question about their goals in a way that suggests that they're thinking normatively, that this is a sort of an ethical stance that they're taking, and not just a stance about, you know, the actual economic outcomes or the socioeconomic outcomes of their children. In fact, there was one respondent, and I'm not quite sure what to do with it, in the Life Histories and Social Change interview, who responded to the question with a question of his own: do you mean economic values or moral values? And I thought that was a very interesting response on his part, where he was himself distinguishing between, you know, what sociologists call aspirations and what they call values, but he was somewhat unique in that sense. Most people sort of wrap the two of them up together. So just to talk a bit, and you can tell me how I'm doing time-wise, Darren. I'm equally likely to be way too short as to be way too long, so let me know. So the first part, to talk about looking at the Growing Up in Ireland data and talking about contemporary parents' values and aspirations for their children. Now, this is still work in progress, so don't hold me to anything in terms of this sort of image from multiple correspondence analysis. This is from the European Values Survey, the 2008 wave for Ireland. I looked just at people who were parents, but also people who had obeyed the rule about answering the question. If you've worked with these data, you may be aware that sometimes people don't, the interviewers don't follow the rule, and in some cases respondents were asked to prioritise just 5 values, and in another case they didn't follow that rule and allowed the participant to prioritise as many values as they wished. So I only included participants who had followed the rule. So basically you can see that in 2008 in Ireland, it looks very much like what, if you were reading Melvin Cole or Dwayne Allwyn or any of these guys, what you would expect to find. So you have a cluster up here of imagination, independence, hard work and responsibility, and on the other side, a cluster of more traditional values centred on obedience, unselfishness and faith. The kind of variables that distinguish between different social groups are much more sort of less distinguishing, but generally, just looking at, and I've only done sort of bivariate analysis, I've only done sort of cross tabulations, generally speaking, younger, more educated and female parents are more likely to prioritise the qualities associated with autonomy in the European Values Survey. Now, so looking at the qualitative data then, well, one of the things that we found, similar to what Sarah Irwin and her colleagues found, is that if you ask people what they value or what they want for their children, they almost all, very universal response, it seems almost like a pat response, I just want them to be healthy and happy. So it's kind of the expected response, isn't it? But it's very common. However, there are some other interesting features that come out through a sort of in-depth qualitative analysis. One of them that surprised me was how widespread the kind of rejection of pushing was. So people feel that, you know, to be a pushy parent is a bad parent. And so they very often say, well, I'm not that kind of person. No, I don't live through my children. I don't like to push my children. But particularly when you're looking, and this is where it's interesting to think about this in the context of Laroe's research, particularly with people from higher socioeconomic household backgrounds, and I can explain how the growing up in Ireland people calculate that if you're interested. You have this pattern of what's nudging. It's almost kind of funny, where they talk about, and this occurs in both data sets, where they say, well, they ask their children, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they tell these stories. And then this is an example that the child says, oh, I want to be a fireman. And the mother says, well, that's nice. Would you like to be a doctor? And actually, this quotation is much longer than that, because she talks about how her husband says to the boy, oh, that's right, you do what makes you happy, don't worry about money. And then she goes, oh, well, money will help you to be happy, you know. Money is a good thing. So you can see the way in which the narrative evolves. It sort of starts with this rejection of pushing, this sort of encouragement of the child to be imaginative, independence, and then this nudging towards the kind of desired destination that the middle-class parent or upper-middle-class parent. And then the kind of final sentence coming back to the researcher saying, but no, we're not actually that kind of parent, we just want them to be happy and secure. So a very interesting and quite common pattern. I often, when I go to a presentation myself, I often find too many quotations can be really kind of hard to take in, so I've tried to minimize them. But on the other hand, there is a very distinctive contrast with lower socioeconomic parents in lower income households, where they emphasize this idea that children should find their own way. So very often they will say things, well, yes, and ideally I'd like them to go to university, and but it's really up to them. They have a mind of their own, is the kind of quotation you might hear. They'll do whatever. I hope they stay away from drugs and they do the best they can, but ultimately it's up to them.
When people say, oh no, I don't believe in pushing, do you believe them? I mean, it's not unknown for people to say things on interviews they don't really mean.
Absolutely, but I'm not really. I think what they're saying is that they know that this is a shared societal value. That's the point that I'm trying to make. It's not whether they themselves don't believe or don't believe in pushing. Their responses reflect the fact that in Ireland there is a kind of deference or lip service to the idea that one shouldn't be a pushy parent. That to me is the interesting phenomenon. Whether the individual parent really believes that deep down or not, I don't know. But it's intriguing to me that, and it helps to explain the contradiction that Laroe found, that on the one hand, there's this idea you should let children be independent, you should let them be creative, but on the other hand, you do everything you possibly can to ensure that they actually achieve the socioeconomic status that you think is right. So yes, I mean, obviously there are lots of things that we could disbelieve in parents' responses. Quite a few of the another common pattern across all socioeconomic groups in the Growing Up in Ireland data is a parallel emphasis on the quality of relationships with others. So you quite frequently find people saying that have to do with what they think the quality of their relationship with other people should be, what kind of a person they should be, like Sean's mother on the previous slide talking about him being honest and being a good person to his friends and so on. Now, there was a hypothesis that this would be gendered in the quantitative research, that we would expect women to be more likely to value these relatedness things, attributes, but Zhao did not find that in her research, and I would have to say in general I don't see it in the qualitative data here either, that the men maybe talk about relationships in a slightly different way, but still emphasize the quality of relationships as a value to be desired as much as women do. So this is how I tried, when I was doing the analysis, I was trying to think, well, given that the difference between a quantitative and a qualitative analysis is in a quantitative study, you can say, pick the 5 attributes that you think are more important, and people are, as our students sometimes say, forced into a box, so they have to choose those 5, and that provides you with a sort of clear boundary of the clusters of responses that you get. With qualitative research, people have the option to transgress boundaries as much as possible. As we just talked about, they have the option to talk about things that are always completely contradictory, and to say, refer to many different kinds of values and attributes in their responses. So what I tried to do was to cluster the responses according to the ethoses that I'm arguing structure the pattern of social change and the pattern of responses. And I tried to use a kind of, it's not fuzzy set analysis, but to use the principles of fuzzy set coding to weight the responses. So if a person said the only thing that really mattered to them was achievement, then they would get 1 for achievement. But if they half said achievement and then they half said relationships, I would give a 0.5 to each. I tried to find a way of visually representing the distribution of these different kind of ethoses or normative configurations. And so what you can see, if it makes sense, you can see there's quite this ethos of standing back and let children find their own path appears much more predominant amongst people in the lowest household income category than it does in people in the highest household income category. So the larger circles that are darker colours reflect a heavy weight on a particular ethos, and the smaller circles with the lighter colour reflect a lighter weight. But I suppose the point is that these things appear across all socioeconomic clusters. They're weighted or reflected differently in different groups. Okay, so moving on from the growing up in Ireland data to talk a bit more about the life histories and social change data. So thinking about what parents told us about what their values and aspirations were for their children when they were growing up. So there are obvious problems or concerns that you might have with this kind of question. And Julia Brannan has written, I think, a very insightful article about this, where she talks about, we know that people's memories are reasonably accurate in many respects, but on the other hand, we also know that people's perceptions and judgments about what happened in the past very much depend to some extent about what they perceive the world to be like in the present. So people's understandings about what are good or normal or desirable child-rearing practices in the present, for example, will affect the way they remember or the way they talk about the things that happened in the past. So that's just something to bear in mind, and something that we have to try to think about when we do this kind of analysis. So this again is my attempt to look at, within the 3 cohorts in the study, look first of all about what the European Values Survey suggests, looking at these 4 attributes. Now the European Values Survey, the World Values Survey look at a whole range of attributes and ask parents to choose the top 5 amongst them. But these 4, religious faith, imagination, independence and obedience, have normally been associated with autonomy and independence. So imagination and independence is usually associated with evaluation of autonomy and self-direction, whereas religious faith and obedience are usually associated with traditional values, with conformity and so on. So if you look at the oldest cohort, what you see are all of the cohorts, the most striking change is the decline in adherence to religious faith. This is occurring across all cohorts, even amongst the oldest between the 1980s and the most recent round of data collection in the European Values Survey. Though it's interesting that religious is still the most sort of frequent attribute chosen by the older participants, but the extent to which they value it has declined significantly. It's really gone down in this 3rd youngest cohort as well. The other sort of very clear trend is an increased proportion of people likely to select imagination. Again, that's occurring across all the cohorts. The trends for independence and obedience a little bit more mixed, particularly in the younger cohorts here, and this is the point that obedience is still, more than 40% of people selecting obedience as one of the top 5 attributes that they value in their children. Now, if those of you who are more expert on this know that something about the weights or something might affect my finding, I'd be very grateful for any tips that you can give me. This chart shows you, gives you an idea of the historical period that the memories in the life histories and social change study are likely to cover. So this is the parents' own when they were 9 years old themselves, dating from 1920 through to 2010, and the lighter bars are the period when they were parenting 9-year-old children. Now this is based on the life calendar data that we collected also as part of this Life Histories and Social Change database. So we asked people to tell us, when their children were born and so on. I suppose the most interesting thing to observe here is the very large family sizes in the oldest cohort mean that they were parenting 9-year-old children, or at least some of them were, much longer in historical time than in the younger cohorts. And you can see the youngest cohort here, the likely overlap with the Growing Up in Ireland study. Okay, so looking at the oldest cohort, the interesting thing about this, I suppose, first of all, yes, it's true, they're much more likely to talk about religion. There's no question about that. But what's notable about it is that very often they talked about religion in response to an explicit prompt by the researcher. Because the researcher would say, because they would expect to find it, and what about religion? Because, oh yes, religion was very important. But the other thing that's quite interesting is that religion, as a kind of obligation, my argument would be, is that it's framed as part of, it's understood in the context of the obligations that you have to others. So being, adhering to your Christian faith, for example, a number of them would talk about how they tried very hard to get their children or their children to raise their grandchildren in the religious faith, and it was expressed as, this is something that you owe me, do it for me. At least bring the children to church until they're old enough to take their confirmation, or at least when you get engaged, when you go into, one woman talked about getting on the phone to her son and saying, well, when you've got engaged, just for my sake, will you go in and have the ring blessed, or whatever it was that she was asking him to do. So the point is that people talked about religious values in this context, I think, of a sort of set of ideas about the values and obligations that we have towards one another. So, but the most striking thing is how vehement many of the people in this oldest cohort were about adhering to this principle of standing back and not interfering. And this occurred across all the socioeconomic groups. This is an example from a man from a higher SES background. They wouldn't have known, he said, yes, I wanted them to go to university, but I was very determined that they wouldn't have known that I had that expectation of them because I didn't believe in pushing or pressurizing my children. And this is quite a common theme articulated, particularly within this cohort. So I would argue, I think, that, and this is maybe a little bit of an interpretive leap, that this, if you look again at the context of the people's stories and how they talk about this rejection of pushing, what they're rejecting was in fact the constraints that they themselves had experienced in childhood. So this is a group of people who grew up in an Ireland that was dominated by a lot of institutional control and a lot of socioeconomic restrictions. So when somebody within this cohort says, I'm not going to tell my children what they should do, they're actually articulating a modern preference for independence and autonomy. And this is actually consistent with what Owen found in the American 1920s study of Middletown. They also found sort of this kind of pattern where people were saying, no, even though they might not be talking about imagination, they might not be talking about creativity, but they're definitely talking about this idea that children should have the freedom to choose their own path. So I would argue, despite their adherence to religion and their commitment to this idea of sort of a certain kind of relationships with others, by rejecting this notion of pushing, they're actually adhering to a kind of modern ideal of independence. The striking thing about the middle cohort, and it really stands out, is the word happiness appears for the first time. The oldest cohort never mentioned happiness. It doesn't occur to them that this is something that they could hope for their children, or that this was a value or an aspiration, that their children would be happy. But it appears very strikingly and dramatically within the cohort of people born in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So
there was no happiness or sex before television?
Apparently not. But I suppose, in a highly constrained socioeconomic environment, where making a living, subsistence was something that was, potentially threatened. Happiness isn't really, if you have a sort of Maslowian hierarchical approach to it, happiness isn't really something that you aspire to. But this middle cohort, very interestingly, bring in this word happy. Some of them even say, just like my parents, I wanted me to be happy. But it's really striking that their parents don't use the word happy, it's they who bring in this word. happy. Within the existing ethos of achievement, for example, which also appears in the oldest cohort, that their children should do well in school and achieve the best that they can, particularly amongst people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, this idea of cultivation is starting to sneak in this cohort, that parents should be doing things to help their children to achieve. Another change that I thought was quite interesting is that they're also emphasizing the values of relatedness and how the quality of one's relationships with others. But they're starting to emphasize things like communication and kindness, and they're also starting to emphasize interpersonal relationships more. So they're starting to talk about the quality of relationships that people have with their spouses, for example. I suppose it's not really surprising in one sense, but it's not something that has really shown up, I think, in the quantitative research. So that's just an example from people at the sort of the opposite. Now, I should say socioeconomic status is where they were when we interviewed them, so not necessarily the same thing as where they were when they were bringing up their children, which is another thing you might want to ask me about. And then looking at the youngest cohort, again here, universally, if happiness comes in for the first time in the middle cohort, it's something that's almost universally aspired to by the people that we interviewed for the third cohort in the life history and social change. We have this emergence of this phenomenon of nudging, where people tell these stories about the one that I remember from this was a lovely one in this cohort, where she talks about how her son says he wanted to work in a factory. And so it's panic, He's an upper class person. He says he wants to work in a factory. And then we had a bit of a chat about it, and it turned out that actually he wanted to, test drive the cars, and then actually it turns out that he wanted to own the factory. So that was all right. She doesn't put it quite like that, but it's almost like that, where she's sort of saying, what am I going to do? My son wants to work in a factory. And we shouldn't laugh at people, I suppose. They're being very honest in telling us about it. And you can see this phenomenon of nudging. In this group, there was a little bit of differences from the growing up in Ireland parents. More people talked about the contrast that their own children, that they hoped for their own children from their own experience, like this person who talks about, they want them to go to college. And it's really interesting. I've edited the quote down a bit. She's talking about the importance of college as an experience and traveling to broaden the mind. So there's this emphasis on fulfillment that occurs within this group. And the other thing that comes up in the life history and social change, which doesn't really come up in the growing up in Ireland group, is this idea of tolerance for others, being understanding, and sort of, for example, children with special needs. A number of parents talk about how they would like their children to be understanding and appreciative of children with special needs in their classrooms, and how they give out to their children for studying of people who appear to have. Now, one of the things that's I sort of thinking about what would explain the divergence, it might just be the economic crisis. The people in the life histories and social change cohort were interviewed just before they could see the problem coming. A number of people talk about it. Oh my goodness, where is it all going to end? But they're still kind of in the middle of the tail end of the boom, whereas the parents in the Growing Up in Ireland study are very much being interviewed in the middle of the sort of height of the crisis in 2008, and I think that may affect some of their responses. So this just shows you the distribution of these ethoses by cohort, and you can see that standing back and allowing children to find their own path has, in the life histories and social change data, just disappears by the third cohort. But I think that has to do with the class composition of the people who talked about their values and aspirations in the life history and social change study. You can see how happiness has just become so much more heavily weighted in the youngest cohort than it was, and how it sort of appears really for the first time in this middle cohort. You can see as well, because of this idea of respect, and again, maybe you might want to challenge me and say, if somebody says they should be tolerant of children with special needs, is that really the same ethos as somebody who says, well, you should respect your neighbours and you should be a good citizen? You might want to challenge me on that, because I'm not sure myself, but for the moment I'm sort of arguing that these really are the same ethos with different inflections. Okay. So, concluding, what are the key findings from this study? Substantively, I want to make these sort of two claims. First of all, that this ethos of standing back, of saying children should find their own way and path, that they shouldn't be pressurized or pushed, is actually an innovation linked to modernity. It's how people promote or articulate the value of independence when they find themselves in relatively constrained institutional or socioeconomic contexts. So, whereas people in all socioeconomic contexts raising their children, let's say in the 1950s or earlier, felt themselves to be in a somewhat constrained institutional environment, by the end of the 20th century, it's particularly people in lower socioeconomic groups that find themselves with these kinds of constraints. So if you do not feel empowered to achieve things for your children, the best that you can do is say, I'm going to stand back and let them achieve what they can themselves. So it is nonetheless a commitment to a modern ideal, I would argue, of independence and autonomy. I think this cultivation that Leroux talks about, I suppose this isn't really a very radical finding, but it emerges amongst people who perceive that they have some capacity to influence their children's lives, and particularly it emerges in the context of the growing importance of education. So if you can ensure that your children have the best educational opportunities that they can, and it increasingly appears to be the case that education is the key to socioeconomic attainment, cultivation for achievement becomes much more important. Across all of the cohorts that I've looked at and all of the data, there is a consistent, it's not universal amongst all participants, but there is a group of participants in each of the different groups who emphasize positive relationships with others as that's something that they value. I think there is a directional change away from, positive relationships comprising respect, really, towards positive relationships comprising communication and understanding. And the other key substantive finding, I think, is this significant innovation within the middle cohort, whereby they start to talk about happiness as something that should be valued and aspired to. Theoretically, I think that thinking about values and aspirations in this way as sets of shared normative configurations that are available to and can be mobilized to a greater or lesser extent by different groups within society and in different historical periods, I would argue is an improvement on thinking about values and aspirations as attributes of individuals. So in other words, I think if we sort of shift perspective and think of them as attributes of society that individuals can mobilize and that overlap in terms of the ways in which people articulate and express their own values and aspirations, can help to explain or clarify some of the contradictions that have been found in the more recent research. I think you can see this directional change in inflection and weight that I talked about. And I think the last point, which I haven't maybe drawn out as much in the presentation, is that it's very clear, I think, and this is consistent with kind of new research on morality and sociology and so on, that people's values and aspirations for their children are fundamentally ethical, in the sense that they are based on ideas about what is good, not just for the self, but also for society as a whole. So they're based on a moral framing or understanding of the future as much as they are on aspirations about socioeconomic attainment. So I think if we don't retain that understanding that these are ethical or moral sets of values, we lose much of what people are trying to tell us when they answer these questions, either on survey questionnaires or in qualitative studies like this one. So thank you.